This is your PowerPoint for the PowerPoint quiz on Western Expansion. Natives of the Midwest. The main Native American groups in the Midwest in the late 1800s included the Pawnees and the Lakotas. They primarily practiced hunting and gathering, fishing, trading, and raiding. There were wars between these different tribes in order to gain control over the region. The Native Americans had gained horses from the Spanish back during the 1500s and 1600s. They used these in order to hunt what was most important to them, which was the buffalo. The buffalo was seen as a spiritual manifestation of the gods. However, during this time, they did change their practices due to the worldwide fur trade, including a trade with the French and the English. Early U.S. relationships. The United States had promised land west of the Mississippi to the Native Americans. However, this changed in the mid-1800s when there was gold finds in California, Colorado, and Oregon. Then there was the discovery of gold in Montana, which led to the creation of the Bozeman Trail. In 1868, a treaty was signed called the Fort Laramie Treaty, which established a new reservation system in California, Kansas, and Nebraska. The Treaty of Grenville then established protocol in order to deal with the Native Americans primarily through centralization of authority of the chiefs. The Transcontinental Railroad and Gold. Settlers saw Native Americans as a nuisance to gain gold in areas like the Black Hills. Also, the U.S. government wanted to build a transcontinental railroad which would connect the East and the West for trade and nation building. The railroad would establish a breaking point that buffalo would instinctively not cross over in order to find food on the other side. This disrupted Native American hunting patterns and overall cultural ways of life. General Philip Sheridan of the U.S. Cavalry pursued a policy to isolate and then move the Native Americans off the plains. In fact, trained tourists who came through these areas would oftentimes move through the areas, killing the buffalo by shooting them from the train. The Sioux Wars. The U.S. Army confronted the Sioux and Lakota Indians on the northern plains. Colonel George Custer, who had been warned not to go into Little Bighorn until he would have enough people behind him in order to support him, decided instead to go into Little Bighorn without these proper reinforcements, and he was slaughtered. The U.S. troops then came into the area to gain revenge and killed the major Native American leaders, like Crazy Horse. One of these leaders, Sitting Bull, escaped into Canada, but he eventually had to return and he surrendered at the Little Bighorn Reservation. The Massacre at Wounded Knee. The Sioux were centralized on this reservation with poor land. However, gold was then discovered at Little Bighorn. The United States made a deal with the Indians to move them to the outskirts of the reservation and build a railroad that would go right through the middle of the reservation. One of the Native American leaders, a man named Wovoka, established a traditional Indian ceremony called the Ghost Dance, which was intended to invoke the ancestors' protection. However, while he was doing this, the U.S. Cavalry surrounded the Indian group that was dancing according to this traditional dance, and then fired into the crowd, killing over 100 men, women, and children. The American policy with Indians. At that point, the government formed the Indian Bureau. It was typically run by people who were inexperienced or at the end of their careers and simply did not want to really have to manage the Native Americans. The United States also passed the Dawes Severalty Act. This would make Indians into more like middle-class Americans. Indians would get a single plot of land for their family, they would learn hardworking and farming skills, and Native Americans would become like Americans and then be respected. By the end of this process, though, a famous author named Helen Hunt Jackson wrote a book called A Century of Dishonor, in which he explained how the American policy towards Indians misunderstood their communal culture and did far more damage. Notice that the Dawes Severalty Act attempted to make Native Americans like middle-class Protestant Americans, but Native Americans did not do well in a society in which people were limited to the nuclear family. They instead lived in communal families, including their extended family. When they were separated from this on the farmlands, it caused massive depression, higher rates of alcoholism, and higher rates of suicide. Westward Expansion. Joseph Smith formed the Mormon religion in the East. He was driven out at that point due to his belief in polygamy. The Irish, the Germans, Russians, and Bohemians, and Scandinavian immigrants also sought out new land in the West. And the United States government provided incentives for this through the homestead grants, where families could buy land for only $10 after living there for a required amount of years. Railroad development. This then led to the development of the Transcontinental Railroad, which included the Northern Pacific, Central Pacific, and Southern Pacific. The U.S. government provided grants to railroads to buy these lands. Irish immigrants worked on the railroad in the East and Midwest. In California, Chinese immigrants worked on the railroad both in California and in the Southwest. The credit Mobilier scandal. The U.S. federal government provided grants to the Union Pacific to build the Transcontinental Railroad. Union Pacific leaders created the Credit Mobilier, making it look like a separate construction company. The Credit Mobilier took government money and invested it into stocks and bonds. The Credit Mobilier also paid congressmen in stocks and bonds in order to make sure that they wouldn't investigate into what the Union Pacific was doing in order to make it look like the Credit Mobilier was actually a separate company. This allowed the Union Pacific to gain money from the government, use that money not for building railroads so much, but use it to actually create their own investments to create more profit, and then to influence congressmen to keep this going. Race and ethnicity. The Irish at the time were seen as inferior on the East Coast. Typical for WASPs at this time period, or white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, to classify Irish people and African Americans on the same level racially, in which they would claim that both groups were somehow racially inferior. Because of this, the Irish looked for opportunities elsewhere, and they moved out west to find jobs in San Francisco. But when they got there, they found that the railroad was already completed. And this was largely due to the large Chinese immigration that had been used for labor to build the railroads. The Irish, under the leadership of Dennis Kearney, then blamed the Chinese. They rioted in Chinese communities, shooting and hanging Chinese males. Eventually, this led to a statewide and a national law of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which kept out all new Chinese immigrants. This law was not repealed until after World War II. Farmer versus the railroad. Farmers who settled the land eventually faced diminishing returns. Due to domestic and foreign competition in farming and overall overproduction, prices began to fall. Farmers could not keep up. The farmers also blamed the Transcontinental Railroad for the high prices for freight goods. They pointed, for example, to the higher prices for short hauls versus the cheaper prices for long hauls. This seemed strange to them. It would seem that if you were traveling over a longer road, there would be more problems of Indian attacks, disease, destruction of property, therefore higher prices. You would think that the higher prices would have been on the long hauls, not on the short hauls. Farmers pointed to this and pointed to the problems of the concentration of wealth and power for people who controlled the railroads. Farmer movements. Farmer alliances. The farmers allied together in order to try to get states to regulate the railroad. Also, they worked to create local cooperatives to share goods that were created by farmers. The Grange movement worked to get states to regulate the railroad. Populists then came after these movements and had the most amount of success. The populists believed that the government should own the railroad and telegraphs, institute an economic income tax on the rich, and create more money in society through something known as bimetallism, or the use of both gold and silver to back up money. The idea behind that was that they could put more money into society and therefore boost overall consumerism. Then more people would buy more farming goods, they could raise prices, and they could pay off their costs. The major problem within the farmer groups was a division in the movement between poor white and black farmers. This racial antagonism between these two groups eventually led to a breakdown in most of these farmer movements.